God is a house not built by someone. Now let's use our dubious brains and corrupted souls to solve all the problems in philosophy as they relate to the topic of whether or not God exists. And then when we're done with all of that, you can tell me that I couldn't possibly know what I'm talking about. Can you guess what I'm going to tell you in return? You're slowly catching on, aren't you? A tour through these issues may be instructive. The only philosophical argument given for God's existence in the Bible is Hebrews 3:4, which says, "For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything." And yet God himself is a house not built by someone. God the Father didn't need a God the grandfather, right? No God the great-grandfather either? And yet conceptually and metaphorically, everything and everyone God created would be a house that had a builder. Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Well, I'm sorry, that psalm didn't explain how a God is a super sentient mind with unlimited magic powers to do literally whatever he wants gets to just sound so darn designed and not be at all designed. An infinite supermind with unlimited abilities sounds like one of the most designed kinds of things there could ever be. Would it be foolish to not notice such a glaring issue? In the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Christian apologists Norman Geisler and Frank Turek tell us that it would take the equivalent of 1,000 encyclopedias to describe a simple cell. For the sake of argument, I'll take the claim for granted. In all likelihood, the first accidental replicator was much less complicated. No first step has even been proposed by science, and so evaluating just how much information it would take to describe it or what the exact odds would be to naturally generate it are not currently possible to determine. To my knowledge, science just isn't there yet. Regardless, the authors of the book explain to their readers that they just can't believe that information for the first self-replicator came about by chance. Fair enough. Abiogenesis is a sufficiently extraordinary claim that requires sufficiently extraordinary proof. A molecular 3D printer that comes together by chance and keeps making ever-diversifying copies by the trillions of trillions, some of which even become sentient, for billions of years is quite a crazy-sounding claim on the face of it. One does not simply wake up one morning and look out the window to find out such an outrageous claim is obviously true. It has been quite a task for collective humanity to get to a place of investigation of the world to determine that such a state of affairs is probably true. So you have my permission to be skeptical of abiogenesis, but I will ask that you maintain that standard across the board. The competing explanation for the origin of life coming from Christianity is, of course, God. I don't see any uncreated magical creating being around any more than I see newly formed self-replicating molecules happening by chance. They are both extraordinary claims, well outside the domain of ordinary human expertise. That shouldn't be too hard for anyone to admit. But I wonder how much information it would take to fully describe an infinite supermind like God. Do you suppose Geisler and Turek even addressed the issue? I don't think they did. I wonder what they would say. My peon brain says an infinite amount of information. And Christians, if forced to actually contemplate the issue, which in my experience they just can't even process the question and have no idea what I'm talking about, would have to tell us that amount of information to describe their infinite supermind is apparently zero. Only gods are extremely easy to come by in terms of metaphysical accident, it seems. But not so much self-replicating molecules, even given trillions of galaxies full of complex molecular soup. But how would Geisler and Turek know any of this? Let's set up a more fair fight here. Is the ratio of competing apparent design between abiogenesis and God 1,000 encyclopedias to 0, what the Christian scale would have to be, or an infinity of encyclopedias to 1,000, an atheist scale for the sake of argument? Remember, the Christian God knows literally everything as just one of his amazing attributes, and apparently can store this unlimited information in exactly the equivalent of 0 encyclopedias. That's amazing. Or utterly ridiculous beyond words. You decide. Decide. Are you sure it takes more faith to be an atheist? In my view, probably the most important question to be asked in the Does God Exist debate or the Who Created the Universe debate is Who created God? Or why doesn't the designer need a designer? because the answer to that kind of question is much more revealing of where our collective human ignorance ought to find itself on all four questions. If we are honest about the question of the true metaphysical origin of design, we should quickly realize we have no idea what we're ultimately talking about, and that popular theological, teleological inference to a creator is nowhere near as strong as convinced theists would surmise. So who created God? What? He doesn't need a creator for some reason? Do those reasons even have to do with design? Are those reasons all metaphysical speculation humans are generally unqualified to resolve from the comfort of our armchairs? Uh-oh. But, let's lean back deep into our philosophical armchairs anyway, buckle up, ignore that we'd never trust 10 random other humans to get these issues at all right, pretend like we're totally going to nail it, and take a look at our supposedly entirely undesigned God. So God doesn't need a designer because he didn't have a beginning. Well, an all-powerful God could create things with eternal pasts. Hence, things without beginnings can be created. So it's still legitimate to ask who created even an eternal God if that God appears to be a specially complex entity. William Paley strikes back. If an indestructible pocket watch with unlimited energy to tick forever had an infinite past, would that give you no indication that it had been designed? So beginnings don't mean much, since it is the special composition of a thing that may infer design. God doesn't need a designer because he is an immaterial entity and doesn't have physical parts to assemble. Supposedly the human mind would also be an immaterial entity, and yet its mental organization needs to be designed by God. How much more so the divine mind itself? And really, immaterialism is clearly a conceptual smokescreen on this issue. The human brain is literally the most highly specialized construction of matter that we know of. And note, science has shown that mental states are completely at the mercy of the physical construction of the brain. Yet theism here has us passing off a supermind, rather the most impressive possible mind ever, as completely undesigned. That's ludicrous. Perhaps the universe is really an immaterial entity and therefore doesn't need to be designed. It doesn't seem like it would be. Well, you know what? An infinite supermind doesn't sound like it would be either. It sounds way more super designed than a big dumb universe. And remember, when you dream, can't you find yourself in an apparent dimensional universe, but in reality it's all the mind's construction? And don't you think the mind and all of its contents are immaterial? So couldn't the universe and the waking world be immaterial and not need a designer? Sure, the dreams we know of need minds, but perhaps they don't always need that. Perhaps there are free-range mental properties that don't have to be housed in a mind. How in the world would you know? So God is a necessary being, a brute fact of reality, and therefore cannot have a designer, whereas the universe is a contingent state of being. But how do you know the universe itself is not a brute fact of reality and therefore doesn't need a designer? Does it have a label on it or something? If someone said they don't feel particularly comfortable evaluating the universe in this way, would they be wrong in their humble hesitation? If cosmologist Max Tegmark's ultimate ensemble universe model is correct, then the universe, as an example of a mathematical object, could be one tiny iteration of an infinite number of slightly varying mathematical objects, each with different arbitrary beginnings, energy levels, etc., and a grand Christmas tree of all universe-like possibilities. I don't know that he's right, but you don't know that he's wrong. Does it sound preposterous to get to propose such a ludicrous-sounding metaphysical situation? Well, have you considered that Tegmark's ultimate ensemble universe is virtually identical to God's infinite knowledge of all mathematically describable objects? So you are unwittingly proposing the same thing. Tegmark's view happens to be the more modest view on balance, as there is no theocortex that needs to create duplicates of things that would already necessarily exist. Didn't see that one coming, did you? But seriously, what does Max Tegmark know? For that matter, what do I know? We're all just measly humans and don't really know any better. By the way, all Christians are also just, measly humans. Please note that these complex metaphysical and philosophical issues are far and necessary departures from the original inference to design, and yet design is likely the primary argument theism has used to prop itself up throughout the ages, even though the debate doesn't sufficiently turn there. Hence, in all likelihood, the vast majority of actual theistic belief found in human minds was founded fallaciously. Most people don't even know these debates exist, much less are able to tell you anything about them, much less agree with each other on the answers. Even professional philosophy has only a small majority leanings on these issues, though in favor of naturalism, by the way. Can actual infinities exist? Do immaterial entities exist? Are minds all physical or partly immaterial? Is the necessary versus contingent states of being real, and how do we know when that applies? Is A theory of time or B theory of time true? Etc. You can argue with my answers to these questions, but we're no longer arguing about design, which is the core issue, and we're necessarily in highly speculative territory, which amounts to grossly diminishing returns for a positive case for theism, much less than for any strident personal form of Christianity. My answers may indeed be wrong, but I'm in good company. If humans reliably come to all sorts of contradictory conclusions on these issues, or don't even ponder them at all, which is more typical, then a human consensus on the teleological argument is irrelevant. It can't be said to be obvious that the apparent design of the universe or anything in it is settled by an obviously uncritical and unqualified majority. Most people think God is real, just doesn't mean anything. So does every house even need a builder after all? Sounds like we don't really know the answer to that one. To me, theism uses their proposed infinite supermind to explain the appearance of design in things that necessarily grossly pale in comparison when it comes to the apparent design of the designer. Something's definitely wrong here, wouldn't you say? Proverbs 11:1 says, "The Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." If atheists have to show Christians a multiverse, the Big Bang, abiogenesis, and macroevolution, why don't Christians have to show atheists God and his creative abilities, as well as explain why he even has the characteristics and abilities that he has? If neither party has the evidence to show for itself, then why aren't we all agnostics? Wouldn't that be the only intellectually honest position to hold? But something tells me the vast majority of theists, when they are asking for amazing evidence of atheism, or metaphysical naturalism that is, are not asking their questions equally hard of their own worldview. Further, are we allowed to verify that God is actually metaphysically absolute and not just a much more powerful being than we are who doesn't mind us thinking too much of him? That could be important so that we could make sure he's not posing as the real supreme God, just like all those other supposed supreme gods who are really just lesser powerful beings, i.e. demons in Christian mythology, pretending to be the supreme God. No? Okay, so this isn't going very well, is it? We're not allowed to ask any questions, apparently. Theists need to own the fact that they're collectively making up an entity that is a highly speculative, conceptually dubious conglomeration that no one has ever seen before. They're pitting it against mountains of data in favor of the general scientific paradigm that has explained many important aspects of origins without God. And most theists are basically calling it a day with no further research or justification for the proposal until they're dead. They should be way more humble and skeptical about what they're doing. But people in large cultural groups with the wind of ancient traditions at their back tend to be super entitled along these lines and just don't notice. But does the Lord detest dishonest epistemic scales or not? Why is a Christian's naturalistic incredulity more important than an atheist's supernaturalistic incredulity? Why can an agnostic be reasonably incredulous about both? I'm assuming you feel like you're being reasonable and fair with the topic, but are you?